It was a crisp autumn morning, and the streets were alive with noise and activity. Cars honked, people chatted, and the cool breeze rustled the golden leaves that had fallen onto the sidewalks. The air smelled of coffee and fresh bread from a nearby bakery. It was a scene full of life, but one person moved through it differently. Emily Harper walked calmly along the sidewalk, her cane tapping in a steady rhythm. The soft tap-tap sound echoed lightly against the bustling environment. She was dressed in a simple coat and scarf, her hair neatly tied back. She appeared unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. But what caught people's eyes if they bothered to look closely was not just Emily herself but the companion by her side. Shadow, her guide dog, was a large German shepherd. His coat gleamed in the morning sun, every movement smooth and deliberate. He stayed close to Emily, his head slightly raised, always alert. There was something about the way he moved that seemed different. Unlike other guide dogs, Shadow carried himself with a calm confidence that hinted at something more than just training. His gaze swept the surroundings, sharp and steady, as if he were quietly assessing everything and everyone around him. Most people, however, didn't pay much attention to Emily or Shadow. To them, Emily was just another blind woman, blending into the crowd. They assumed she was harmless, just trying to get through her day like everyone else. Few people gave her a second glance. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. But if they had known her story, if they had understood who Emily Harper truly was, their casual indifference would have quickly turned into astonishment or even fear. Emily and Shadow had a bond deeper than what anyone could imagine. To Emily, Shadow was more than just a guide dog. He was her partner, her protector, and a constant reminder of a life she had left behind, a life filled with danger and secrets. But none of that was obvious as they moved through the busy streets that morning. Emily's steps were steady, her face serene. But inside, her thoughts raced. She wasn't just another blind woman trying to get from one place to another. She had seen more in her life than most sighted people ever would. She had experienced things that had left her cautious but unshakable. Shadow was a part of that story, a living connection to a past that she rarely spoke about. As they walked, a few passers-by glanced at Shadow, admiring his sleek coat and well-behaved demeanor. One child pointed at him excitedly, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Look at that dog, Mom. He's so cool." The mother smiled politely but hurried her child along, not wanting to disturb Emily. Others didn't even notice the duo. They were too busy staring at their phones or rushing to their next appointment. But Shadow noticed everything. His ears twitched at the sound of a sudden laugh, his head turned slightly when a car engine revved too loudly. He wasn't just guiding Emily, he was protecting her. His movements were calculated, almost military in their precision. Yet he remained calm, his tail swishing lightly as he kept pace with Emily. For Emily, this was normal. She trusted Shadow completely, knowing he would alert her to any danger long before she sensed it herself. Together, they navigated the chaotic streets with ease, their partnership seamless. Emily's hand rested lightly on Shadow's harness, a touch that spoke volumes about their connection. As they passed a coffee shop, the rich aroma of roasted beans filled the air. Emily smiled faintly, enjoying the smell even though she had no intention of stopping. She listened to the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the footsteps of people going in and out. Shadow paused briefly at the curb, ensuring it was safe before leading her across the street. His vigilance was second nature, as natural to him as breathing. Most people would never guess the truth about Shadow. To them, he was just a well-trained guide dog, doing his job. But Shadow was much more than that. He wasn't just any dog, he had a past as extraordinary as Emily's own. Shadow had once been a special ops canine, trained for missions that most humans wouldn't dare undertake. He had worked alongside soldiers, sniffing out danger, protecting his team, and performing feats of bravery that few could imagine. When Shadow retired from his military life, he found his way to Emily. At first, she wasn't sure if a dog with such a history could adapt to being a guide dog. But from the moment they met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Shadow seemed to know exactly what Emily needed, and Emily trusted him with her life. The world around them buzzed with life, but Emily and Shadow moved as if they were in their own bubble, connected by an invisible thread. To Emily, the noises of the city were familiar, almost comforting. The chatter of people, the hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a distant dog, all of it painted a picture in her mind, one that Shadow helped her navigate with precision and ease. But as ordinary as this morning seemed, Emily knew that life had a way of throwing surprises when you least expected them. She had learned that the hard way. And though she didn't show it, she was always prepared for the unexpected. Shadow's presence was a constant reminder of that. His quiet strength, his sharp instincts, they were her reassurance that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. As they continued down the street, a gentle breeze brushed against Emily's face. She lifted her chin slightly, taking in the scent of the changing season. Autumn had always been her favorite time of year. It was a season of transition, of letting go and preparing for what was to come. In many ways, it mirrored her own life, a life that had been full of change, loss, and resilience. To the outside world, Emily Harper was just a blind woman walking her dog. But to those who knew her, truly knew her, she was so much more. And Shadow? He wasn't just a guide dog. He was a hero in his own right, a silent guardian with a past as remarkable as the woman he protected. As the pair disappeared into the crowd, their quiet presence was just a passing moment in the busy city. But for those who looked closer, there was something unforgettable about them. The way they moved together, the way Shadow's eyes seemed to see everything, the way Emily carried herself with quiet confidence, it all hinted at a story much larger than anyone could imagine. A story waiting to unfold. It was a bright morning, the kind that usually felt peaceful, but today the air was heavy with noise and tension. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the usual city hum as a group of bikers stormed into town. Their bikes were loud, their presence impossible to ignore. They parked haphazardly near a coffee shop, engines revving for longer than necessary, as if to make sure everyone around them noticed their arrival. The bikers dismounted with exaggerated gestures, laughing loudly and exchanging crude jokes. Their leather jackets and rough appearances made them stand out against the otherwise ordinary backdrop of the busy street. They were big, loud, and looked like they wanted the world to know they owned the space they occupied. Their laughter spilled into the street, sharp and mocking, as they made rude comments about passers-by. Emily Harper, walking steadily with her guide dog Shadow by her side, had no reason to notice them. The rhythmic tap of her cane led her path, while Shadow stayed close, moving with his usual calm confidence. Emily was heading somewhere, and she had no intention of stopping for the unnecessary chaos unfolding nearby. But the bikers noticed her. One of them, a wiry man with a smirk that seemed permanently plastered on his face, nudged the arm of a larger man beside him. "Hey, check this out," he said, pointing toward Emily. The others turned their heads, their interest piqued for no reason other than the fact that they could. To them, she looked like an easy target, blind, quiet, and unassuming. "Where's the fire, lady?" the wiry man shouted, stepping into her path with a deliberate swagger. Emily stopped abruptly, her cane halting mid-tap. Shadow stood firm by her side, his ears twitching as he silently assessed the situation. Emily tilted her head slightly in the direction of the voice but didn't respond. Her calm demeanor seemed to amuse the man further. "You lost or something," he sneered, grabbing her cane out of her hand with a quick swipe. The sound of the cane leaving her grip echoed loudly, as though the entire street had gone silent for a moment. The other bikers burst out laughing. Their laughter wasn't just loud, it was mean. It filled the space like a taunt, aimed directly at Emily. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a beer belly and a mean streak in his eyes, leaned down and made a move toward Shadow. He nudged the dog lightly with the tip of his boot, smirking as though daring Shadow to react. Shadow didn't move. He didn't flinch. His steady gaze locked onto the man, unblinking, as if silently warning him to back off. There was a quiet strength in the dog's stance that anyone with a shred of awareness would have noticed. But the bikers were too busy entertaining themselves to see it. A faint voice came from the crowd of bystanders who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "Leave her alone," someone muttered, but their words were drowned out by the bikers' cheers. The crowd looked uncomfortable but hesitant to step in. Most people glanced away, not wanting to attract attention to themselves. Emily stood still, her face calm and unreadable. To the casual observer, she might have seemed helpless, but there was something in her posture that hinted at anything but. Shadow remained at her side, his body coiled with a readiness that only Emily could sense. The wiry man twirled the cane in his hand like it was a toy. "You want this back, lady," he mocked, waving it in front of her. "Come and get it." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it, a firmness that cut through the bikers' laughter. "I suggest you give me my cane back," she said evenly. Her words were quiet, but they carried weight. For a brief moment, the wiry man hesitated, his sneer faltering. There was something unsettling about the calm way she spoke, as though she knew something they didn't. But his hesitation quickly turned into a chuckle, and he held the cane out just beyond her reach, still playing his cruel game. "Or what?" he taunted, stepping closer, invading her space. "What's your little dog gonna do? Bite me?" Shadow let out a low growl, barely audible but enough to make the man stop mid-step. The growl wasn't just a noise, it was a warning, primal and unmistakable. The other bikers quieted for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances. The stocky man who had nudged Shadow earlier raised an eyebrow. "Whoa, easy there, pup," he said, trying to laugh it off, but his voice sounded less confident now. The wiry man looked down at Shadow, then back at Emily. "What's the deal with this mutt? You got him trained to scare people?" he asked, his tone laced with forced bravado. Emily didn't answer. She simply tilted her head slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. Shadow took a small step forward, his stance firm and unyielding. The subtle shift in his posture was enough to send a ripple of unease through the group. The crowd of bystanders grew larger, their murmurs blending into the background. "What's going on?" someone whispered. "Why are they picking on her?" A middle-aged woman in a business suit stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Leave her alone," she called out, her voice shaking slightly but determined. The wiry man glanced at the woman, his sneer returning. "Stay out of it, lady. This doesn't concern you," he snapped. But the interruption seemed to break some of the bikers' confidence. They shifted uncomfortably, their laughter fading. The situation was changing, and they could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand why. Emily stood quietly, her calm presence an unspoken challenge. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady and deliberate. "You think you're strong because you can take something from someone who can't see you?" she asked, her tone neutral but cutting. The wiry man's smirk faltered once more. He looked down at the cane in his hand, then at Emily, then at Shadow. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, shoving the cane back toward her. "Take it. Not worth the trouble anyway." As Emily reached out and took the cane, her grip firm and unwavering, Shadow stepped back into position at her side. The bikers lingered for a moment longer, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the tension they had created. "Let's go," one of them muttered, nudging the wiry man. "This isn't worth it." One by one, they climbed back onto their bikes, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence. The engines roared to life, and they sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust in their wake. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, and a few people approached Emily hesitantly. "Are you okay?" the businesswoman asked, her voice kind but cautious. Emily nodded, her expression softening. "I'm fine," she said simply. Her hand brushed over Shadow's head, a silent gesture of gratitude and reassurance. As the crowd began to disperse, one thing was clear: Emily Harper was not someone to be underestimated, and Shadow was far more than just a guide dog. Together, they had faced down bullies without lifting a finger or a paw and walked away with their quiet strength intact. The leader of the gang stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily on the pavement. He was a big man, towering over Emily, with muscles that strained against his leather jacket. His arms were covered in tattoos, dark and jagged, twisting like vines. His face carried a cocky smirk, as if he enjoyed being feared. "And what if we don't give it back?" he sneered, his voice deep and mocking. "What's your little dog gonna do about it?" His question hung in the air, and for a moment, all eyes were on Shadow. The German shepherd stood firm, his sharp eyes locked on the man. He didn't bark or move, he didn't need to. Instead, a low growl escaped from his throat, so soft it could barely be heard over the street noise. But it was enough to make the leader pause, just for a second. Emily bent down slowly, her hand finding Shadow's collar with ease. Her fingers brushed over the worn leather, a silent signal that only the dog understood. "You really don't want to mess with him," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. She wasn't pleading or begging. It was a statement, simple and certain. The bikers burst into laughter again, louder this time, as if trying to drown out their own unease. "What's he gonna do?" one of them shouted between laughs. "Bark us to death." But their laughter didn't feel as strong as before. There was something about the way Emily spoke, the way she carried herself, that didn't match their idea of her. She wasn't scared, and it showed. Nearby, a small group of bystanders had gathered, watching the scene unfold. Most of them looked nervous, unsure if they should step in or stay back. A man in his 40s, wearing a gray coat, leaned closer to the woman next to him and whispered, "That's not just any dog. That's Shadow. I've heard stories about him." The woman frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked in a hushed tone. "He's a retired special ops dog," the man replied, glancing nervously at Shadow. "That dog's trained for things you don't even want to think about. If he wanted to, he could take down any one of them in seconds." The woman's eyes widened as she looked back at Emily and Shadow. She noticed now how the dog didn't seem afraid at all. Instead, he was watching, waiting, like he knew something the bikers didn't. Meanwhile, the leader of the gang stepped closer to Emily. His smirk had faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "What's with the attitude, lady? You think you're better than us just because you've got a fancy dog," he said, trying to sound tough. Emily straightened, standing tall despite her smaller frame. "I don't think anything," she said evenly. "But I know what he's capable of. And you're making a mistake if you think he's just a regular dog." The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. Shadow remained still, his body tense but controlled, like a coiled spring ready to release. The leader chuckled nervously, trying to regain his confidence. "You're bluffing," he said, pointing at Shadow. "He's just a dog. All bark, no bite." But even as he spoke, his voice wavered. The bystanders' whispers had reached some of the other bikers, and their bravado was starting to crack. "What if it's true?" one of them muttered under his breath, shifting uncomfortably. "Don't be stupid," another snapped, though he too seemed less sure. Emily tilted her head slightly, listening to the murmurs around her. She could feel the shift in the air, the tension rising as doubt crept into the bikers' minds. Shadow hadn't moved an inch, but his presence was enough to unnerve them. The leader clenched his jaw, his frustration growing. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, let alone a blind woman with a dog. "You're all talk," he spat. "Let's see what this mutt can really do." But as he took a step forward, Shadow's growl deepened, low and rumbling like distant thunder. It wasn't loud, but it sent a shiver down the spines of everyone who heard it. Even the leader froze, his bravado faltering. Emily's hand remained steady on Shadow's collar. "You've had your fun," she said quietly. "Now it's time for you to leave." Her words carried a weight that no one could ignore. The bikers looked to their leader, waiting for his next move, but he seemed unsure for the first time. The onlookers held their breath, the street growing eerily quiet. The tension had reached its peak, and everyone knew one thing: this wasn't going to end the way the bikers had planned. The leader of the gang, his face twisting with frustration, lunged forward to grab Shadow's collar. His movements were clumsy, full of arrogance, as if he thought the dog wouldn't react. But Shadow was faster, much faster. Before the man's hand could even reach him, Shadow moved like a streak of lightning. In an instant, the dog leapt to the side, twisting his body with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training. Then, with a sudden, powerful motion, he turned back toward the man, his movements sharp and controlled. Shadow didn't bark or snarl, he didn't need to. Instead, he used his weight and speed to knock the leader off balance, sending the man crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped, the sound of their surprise breaking the tense silence. The leader of the bikers, a man who had spent his life intimidating others, was now lying flat on his back, pinned by a guide dog. Shadow stood over him, his powerful front paws pressing into the man's chest. His sharp gaze locked onto the biker's face, unblinking, unwavering. He didn't bite, but his presence alone was enough to make the man freeze in fear. "Get him off me," the leader yelled, his voice cracking as he struggled beneath the dog's weight. But no one in the crowd moved to help him. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a nervous expression, took a step forward. "Stop him," he shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at Shadow, and his courage faltered. The dog's fierce gaze seemed to pierce right through him, freezing him in place. Shadow didn't move. His body remained perfectly still, his focus entirely on the man beneath him. It was as if he were waiting, watching for any sign of further aggression. The leader, pinned and helpless, stopped struggling, his face pale and sweaty. Emily took a small step forward, her cane tapping softly on the ground. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos around her. A faint smile played on her lips as she tilted her head toward the leader. "I warned you," she said, her voice steady and filled with quiet authority. The crowd murmured, their shock slowly turning into admiration. Among them, a man stepped forward hesitantly. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he pointed toward Shadow. "That's Shadow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've heard about him. He's not just a guide dog. He's a former Special Ops K9. His words sent ripples through the crowd. People exchanged astonished looks, the tension in the air shifting. "A Special Ops dog?" someone asked, their voice tinged with awe. "Yes," the man replied, his gaze fixed on Shadow. "He's trained to take down armed men, to detect danger before anyone else can. That dog could end this whole gang if he wanted to. They don't stand a chance." The other bikers, who had been laughing and jeering just moments ago, now looked uneasy. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of fear. One by one, they began to back away, their tough exteriors crumbling. "Come on, let's go," one of them muttered, tugging on the arm of another. "This isn't worth it." The leader, still pinned to the ground, looked up at Emily with wide, terrified eyes. Call him off, he pleaded, his voice trembling. Please, just call him off. Emily didn't respond immediately. She stood quietly, her hand resting lightly on her cane, as if considering his request. Finally, she gave a small nod. Shadow, she said softly. At her command, Shadow released the leader. He stepped back with a controlled grace, returning to Emily's side. His gaze remained sharp, watching the bikers closely as if ready to act again at a moment's notice. The leader scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his jacket. He glanced at Shadow, then at Emily, his face red with embarrassment and fear. Without another word, he turned and hurried toward his bike. The other bikers followed quickly, their laughter and arrogance replaced by silence. The roar of their engines filled the street as they sped away, leaving behind only the faint smell of exhaust. The crowd erupted into applause, cheering for Emily and Shadow. That was incredible, someone said, stepping forward to thank Emily. She smiled faintly, her hand brushing gently over Shadow's head. It wasn't much, she replied simply. Just a reminder that some battles aren't worth fighting. The crowd began to disperse, but they all lingered. People whispered to each other as they walked away, their admiration for Emily and Shadow evident. As for Emily, she turned and continued down the street, her cane tapping softly, Shadow walking calmly by her side. To her, it was just another day, but to those who had witnessed it, it was a moment they would never forget. The leader, his face pale and his hands shaking, took a cautious step backward. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him look small and uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, after an awkward pause, he mumbled, I'm sorry." His voice was barely above a whisper, and the words sounded forced. The other bikers, who moments ago had been full of laughter and arrogance, now stood awkwardly behind him. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Their tough exteriors had crumbled, leaving behind a group of men who clearly wanted to be anywhere else but here. One of them muttered, "Let's just go," his voice low and shaky. The leader nodded, his gaze darting to Shadow, who stood still by Emily's side. The dog's steady presence was enough to keep the entire gang at bay. The leader turned and began to walk away, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The others followed quickly, their movements hurried and uncoordinated, like a group of schoolboys caught in trouble. Emily stood quietly, listening to the sound of their retreating footsteps. Her head tilted slightly, as though she was making sure they were truly leaving. When their engines roared to life in the distance and faded away, she knelt down and reached for Shadow. "Good boy," she said softly, her hand brushing gently over his head. Shadow leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slightly, though he remained alert, his ears still perked. He didn't seek attention or praise, he simply waited, ready for whatever might come next. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the crowd that had gathered around erupted into applause. The sound was loud and filled with admiration, breaking the tension that had hung in the air. People clapped and cheered, their faces lighting up with relief and respect. "That was amazing," someone shouted. "You showed them," another added, their voice filled with excitement. Several people stepped forward to speak with Emily, their words a mixture of gratitude and awe. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached her first. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stood up to them." Emily smiled faintly, her expression calm and composed. "It was nothing," she replied. "Sometimes, people just need a reminder not to underestimate others. Or their dogs." The woman chuckled softly, her nervousness easing. "Well, they certainly won't forget this day anytime soon." A young man wearing a blue jacket stepped forward next. He looked at Shadow, his expression full of wonder. "Is it true?" he asked hesitantly. Is Shadow really a special ops dog? Emily nodded slightly, her hand still resting on Shadow's head. He is. He worked with the military before he retired and became my guide. He's been through a lot, and he's saved more lives than I can count. The young man's eyes widened. Wow, he breathed. That's incredible. He's a real hero. Emily chuckled softly. He is, she agreed. But to me, he's just Shadow. My partner. The crowd murmured in admiration, their gazes shifting between Emily and Shadow. A little girl holding her mother's hand tugged gently at her arm. Mommy, she whispered, her voice full of awe, can we get a dog like him? The mother smiled and knelt down beside her daughter. Dogs like Shadow are very special, sweetheart. They're trained for years to do what he does. She looked up at Emily and added, thank you. You've inspired all of us today.